Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. Welcome to collaborative creation of the OER Metadata Rosetta Stone. My name is Heather White, and I'm from Mount Hood Community College, which is outside of Portland, Oregon. Camille, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. I'm Camille Thomas. I'm a scholarly communications librarian at Florida State University. And then
Hi,
Bill.
everybody. My name is Bill Jones. I'm the Digital Resources and Systems Librarian at SUNY Geneseo, which is in the Finger Lakes area of New York State.
And I should say that I'm the Library Technical Services and OER Coordinator at Mount Hood Community College. So the OER Metadata Rosetta Stone, just a quick recap for, actually, can you go back, Bill, one slide? I just want to recap what the Rosetta Stone actually is, right, in case we've forgotten. So the Rosetta Stone, originally, the Rosetta Stone is from 196 BC, and it was this landmark discovery in archaeology that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? It translated between 3 different languages: Egyptian hieroglyphics, Egyptian demonic script, and ancient Greek. And so this was like the beginning of humans understanding ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Really big deal. Next slide. We thought this would be a good metaphor for what we did with OER metadata. So why does OER metadata need a Rosetta Stone? While there is ongoing improvement in some of the larger OER search engines, librarians sending emails to listservs asking, anyone know of OER on this topic? And keeping old-fashioned reading lists of valuable OER are still very common occurrences. And the reason for this is the metadata is not consistent. So different OER databases or repositories have different application profiles, which are the data entry forms for OER. There are unique user interfaces based off of unique metadata protocols, and there's inconsistent publication data. And the publication data is what turns into metadata to search, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so the gold standard is library research. We've got library catalogs and scholarly research databases that have really robust metadata schemes that are normalized between each other to enable searching, efficient searching. The concept of bibliographic control of descriptive metadata is something that librarians are experts in, but we, specifically systems librarians and technical services librarians and cataloging librarians, but we've been a little slow to bring that whole paradigm to OER. There's been some, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some big steps forward in the right direction of federated searching. So the Mason MetaFinder, the OER MetaFinder, and Oasis, which Bill Jones is behind. These are federated search engines of OER that pull together content from different OER databases. And then there's also EBSCO's Faculty Select that does the same thing. And then it also has the option of a PDA EBSCO or PDA ebook acquisitions model. The issue there is that it's just data in and data out. The metadata is not enhanced for discovery in these federated search engines yet. So the next step is really to translate between the most common metadata standards that are being used in all the various OER databases and library catalogs. And what happens is some languages will fill in the gaps that other languages have, metadata languages. And so what we've done is we've translated between them and come up with a really comprehensive Rosetta Stone, basically. Next slide. And when I say we've done this, this is the group, right? So we've got Bobby Bothman from Minnesota State, Michelle Brennan from OER Commons, Gretchen Guggen from Palsy, Lillian Hogendorn from eCampus Ontario. We've got Bill Jones from SUNY Geneseo and Camille Thomas from Florida State. Holly Wheeler is the cataloger that I work with, and she's the one who's behind the MARC record that we came up with for OER ebooks, and myself. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it off to Camille, who will explain how she pulled all of us together and a little bit more about the project management.
Thanks, Heather. So originally this initiative kind of grew out of conversations that I had with Spark. I was working as a Spark fellow on a totally different project at the time. And part of that work entailed hosting or moderating the monthly liboer calls. And we got kind of a conversation going about OER discovery. So we had one of those meetings feature some people who were working on OER discovery, and just it was a really kind of ripe discussion. And so I began working on another project with Spark to just do some information gathering and talking to people who were already doing the work. And it became really clear that there were some kind of actionable next steps that we could take. And so I found Heather and Gretchen and Holly through the research that they were doing. There are quite a few people that Spark recommended who are knowledgeable about OER discovery or interested in it. And then of course, like people like Bill and Michelle who were working with large repositories like Oasis and OER Commons. And so we were able to pull some people into the group. And I was very excited to get some metadata people into it because this is has been a big barrier. Discovery has been a big barrier, and a lot of the metadata has been inconsistent. And it's been pretty identified as a sticking point across the board. But I don't think metadata people were quite involved in a lot of those conversations. And if they were, it was pretty siloed to the different like repositories and kind of solo initiatives. There wasn't this larger collaborative effort. And so I really wanted to work with Spark and a lot of what Spark does is coalition building and things like that. So getting people talking to each other outside of these silos and pulling people into a group, especially if they had that expertise. And I think there's a lot of people in libraries and other areas who are really interested in OER and would be interested in working on those initiatives, but they're not always there's not always a clear access point for them to do some of that collaborative work. So we were able to form the OER discovery group and like synthesize some of those conversations into action. And a really big initial next step was to kind of address that lack of standardization. And of course, it's not going to work exactly the same as a lot of established ways of describing materials that libraries have traditionally worked on, because OER is a very kind of special context. And, so we thought that it'd be best to come up with some best practices, some kind of give some direction and some clarity, even if that's not necessarily like a standard. And of course, there were standards that were already in existence to work with, so we weren't looking to like reinvent the wheel. Next slide. So in the beginning, we looked at the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America metadata application profile. And I really wanted to have the people in the group who were cataloging and metadata people to identify what would be most useful as a model to work off of. So this is like the model that we used. We also drew from core elements and other schemas like LRMI and what Oasis was doing, what eCampus Ontario was doing. We were really looking at what is commonly used, where do these materials live? Not all institutions that are making OER or hosting OER have repositories necessarily, and if they do, so some of them may be working with their catalog, some of them may be working, it may be a statewide kind of repository, or it may be a single institution. And so, what are they using? Where do these materials live? What's going to be the best fit for the context of OER? So we were really looking at these core elements as what was going to be available to people as they're doing this work on a day-to-day basis, but also drawing from those standards and the kind of schemas that were already out there, and more broadly. Next slide. Okay. So we started by creating this simple table to define the elements and assigned members of the group to define each of the elements by borrowing a definition from existing schemas or creating our own. We were really focused on what does it take to describe OER, what's going to be accurate, what's going to help people when they're selecting materials. So not just finding it, but if there are if course numbers are relevant, if provenance is relevant, because OER has such, the ability to be reused and adapted and have ancillary materials, we wanted to make note of those kinds of things so that it was also describing the use that goes on and not just, something that's standing alone, but something that's kind of living, right? And so, yeah, so the goal was to make the definitions as meaningful as possible. The original table headings were changed in our current version. So we were kind of, as we went along and went through things, we were really tailoring that original model from DPLA to reflect what we were finding. And we had a lot of discussions about our different perspectives of what would be useful and what how we kind of wanted to communicate it. We were constantly being like, how are people going to use this? What's going to happen when they see it? And so we kind of adapted that and tried to make it as straightforward as possible. And now handing it over to Bill.
Okay. Yeah, so Camille had mentioned that these headings had changed as we iterated over the OER metadata Rosetta Stone, and you'll see that later. But one of the other things that we talked about was whether the element was required or recommended or optional. So the required elements, those were a little easier to identify. Those ones that we definitely needed to have within a new record that we were creating. The sticky part was, deciding between whether it was a recommended or optional element. And so some of the required ones, we thought that recommended and optional would both be nice to have, but the recommended ones were ones that we wanted to be required, but they wouldn't necessarily always be available in the existing record if it was going to be remediated. So the record is still considered complete without having these recommended elements in place. Optional elements were also recognized as useful, but that element was still, the record was still seen as complete without that optional element. So we also looked at different metadata schemas that we had mentioned before, and we started off by using the Mount Hood OER MARC template. What Heather and her team had done was develop list out all the MARC headings that they felt were relevant and put descriptors next to them. You can see that here in this link. The slides will be available to you. But you can see in this table here that we started with one column and mapping those different MARC fields right to it. Then we headed over to Dublin Core, and also we made a blend of LMRI and schema.org, because if you look at the LMRI template, we were looking at it on the Creative Commons site, there's only about 10 or 12 elements, and there wasn't enough for us to fill in or map to the 34 elements that we had identified. So with that blend of schema.org and LRMI, we were able to develop different or identify different mapping areas. And now I'm going to go back to Camille.
So one thing that we really wanted to do in thinking about how people would use it and practitioners was to test some records, some sample records. Once we got to a good kind of place with the core elements and test it against the records and see how it really worked in real life with real materials. And so we then could adapt the existing metadata for an item into the OER Rosetta Stone. So like, for example, we added the field for audience, which was missing from our original schema, but was a part of a record that we tested. And there were a few others. And so we defined that one according to OpenAir as well. And I think there were a few others. There were some that didn't quite make it in, which next slide. Which kind of leads to this slide, which we had a lot of discussions. Sometimes like not really heated, but as you can see, there was a lot of discussion about what to include and what not to include was going to be useful. A lot of discussions about definitions and discrepancies and how different schemas that are in the Rosetta Stone were defining usage or defining examples of the elements. And so because I'm not a metadata person, as I like to say, when working in the group, I know just enough to be dangerous. A lot of my role was like in the collaborative process was facilitating the discussions and making note of our decisions, why we decided what we did, the rationale behind it, and just like, you know, when there were new elements, kind of being able to circle back to discussions that we already had about you know, like education level versus course number, which we have on this like meme that we have there. And like, you know, do we need to include both? Do we need to include one? How is it being, you know, how is it going to be relevant to somebody working with the record? And so we decided to keep kind of a flat file structure without subfields. Oh, that was like a constant discussion as well, this, whether or not to have subfields for things, to make it simpler for the metadata operator and the technical programmer, to give flexibility, because like I said, we do understand that there's still a lot of variation in institution or wherever people are working with OER. And so we felt like the more straightforward it was, the more we could provide direction, but also allow for flexibility. And of course, you know, new things are happening with OER all the time. And so we wanted to make room for anything new that came up as well. And Bill.
Okay. All right, so here is the finished draft, or our draft. This is what the Rosetta Stone looks like with these headings. This number column hasn't been filled in yet. We're still deciding, you know, what order to put these in, just to make it easier to read, because, you know, you want kind of labels that are similar to each other to be next to each other in the record, just because it's easier for your brain to chunk it together. So in this column here, we have the labels, and then the mappings between MARC, Dublin Core, and schema.org. These were the definitions that we developed as a group, whether we borrowed them from existing schemas or we developed them on our own. And then this reference column here references where the definition came from. If it was borrowed from somewhere, we indicated that, or if our group created that, we would say our group created this item. And then on the beginning of the document, it just has a brief introduction and then how to use this guide, and then a little bit of information about the required, recommended, and optional elements. And here are the elements that the group decided on. So there are 12 required elements: title, author, subject, description, the language and date, material type and material format, the rights holder, and then the licensing information, the description, title, and URL. The recommended, these were things that would be really, really nice to have, and almost so nice that we'd have them be required, but they might not always be available, so we can't make them required. What they would also be very helpful in findability, discoverability. Those elements were audience, contributor, editor table of contents, file type, file size, the duration of it, you know, how long is it, if it's a video file or an audio file, something that has a time component to it. Identifier, that could be an OCLC number, an ISBN, some type of unique identifier, whether or not some peer review information, education level, course title, and course identifier. And then these are optional elements here. So alternate title, edition statement, page count, publisher, provider, place, provenance, relationship, and is ancillary and has ancillaries. I'm going to go over to Camille.
So that's we're kind of at a place now where we're beginning to look for feedback and comments definitely from other stakeholders, other leaders who are working on OER, and then also from practitioners. And so the document that we're sharing with you all, we are open to all of your comments as well. We made like a special document for the people in this presentation if you're interested in making comment in your reviews. And
Put that
so,
into chat. So I've put 2 links into chat. One is a link to the OER metadata Rosetta Stone, and then the handout with all the other links.
yes. Thanks, Heather.
Sure.
And we're also looking at Canadian metadata language for OpenAIR, which is a kind of European standard, but there are a lot of the people in our group who are in Canada, who are our neighbors, and also a Spark constituency for Spark North America, are looking into that. And so we've been thinking that wasn't a consideration earlier on in the process, I think, except for like one of the elements that we used the OpenAIR definition. But we're looking at that as well. And then we proposed an IMLS grant proposal for fostering implementation. So potentially like remediating, just kind of seeing what the next steps would be for this project and for OER discovery in general. So next slide. This is our contact information, and I'll hand it off to Heather. And then we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, so the vision is that this translation tool will now inform future OER discovery search engines, and we're running some test records. So there was one question, very important question. Bill, what is your cat's name?
That is Professor Leo T. Jones.
He's very professional.
Yes.
Any other questions? I'm looking at chat.
That's awesome.
Like I said, let's see. So Ryan says, I'm glad to hear that you've incorporated schema.org. From what I understand, that is a really powerful for surfacing within commercial search engines. I believe I heard someone creating a learning material or OER extension. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was us, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll also add there were quite a few people who were interested and aware of the work that we were doing, but they weren't working closely with us in like making this resource and talking sort of the technical conversations that we were having. But yeah, there are a lot of other stakeholders that we talked to who are very interested in the work.
So there's a question from Stacy that I missed before, sorry. Have you talked to any platforms like Pressbooks or Manifold about including these in the fields for development? No, but like this giant light bulb is going off in my head when you say Pressbooks, because Pressbooks metadata, in my opinion, I love Pressbooks, but the metadata language that they use, I'm forgetting what it's called, it's so incomplete that it's basically useless compared to what libraries are already using. How do you hope to see folks use this crosswalk map? What would be exciting for you to see? This is what we're figuring out right now. Bill or Camille, do you have a good answer for that one?
I would say just just seeing more robust metadata for OER and metadata that like reflects the type of material that it is, or the different types of material that it is, and just if that could start to emerge, or yeah, like looking at it in our publishing practices. Like I hadn't thought of getting with Pressbooks or Manifold, but I was thinking about incorporating it, you know, at Florida State with our OER publishing projects and the records that we have and things like that. So I would love to see just like if we could somehow notice that kind of wave happening.
Yeah, there are a lot of comments to say, I know we're out of time, a lot of comments suggesting that we talk to vendors. So that would be a future development for sure.
You're welcome to keep on talking. This is Melody, the moderator.
Okay.
You're welcome to keep on the conversation going. I'm just going to stop recording. So
okay.
Thank you.
Thank
guys
you.
for your
Thank you,
presentation,
everyone.
and please continue talking.